with reference to the controversy raised by ContraPoints, my fellow YouTuber ContraPoints, one of the viewers of this channel wrote in to say that he was surprised that I didn't make a comparison between so-called cancel culture and the history of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. I said back, well, I can make a new video discussing that, but the reason why I wouldn't make that comparison, it's partly because I don't think about cancel culture in the way that you do, or in the way that ContraPoints does, perhaps. And it is also partly because I don't understand the history of the Chinese Cultural Revolution in the same way that you do, in the same way that most Western English speakers possibly do. I'm going to here quote my former professor, Wu Guoguang. I even have the date on which he said this. The idealist version of the history of the Cultural Revolution, the idea that the Cultural Revolution was a contest between competing ideals, is fundamentally incompatible with the historical reality of it being a, quote, dirty, fierce power struggle. So the idea in the modern Western imagination is that what happened during the Cultural Revolution is something like the witch trial that ContraPoints has described, and that people are now examining and bemoaning our current cancel culture pattern of people having rumors and innuendos, and these rumors get out of hand, and overly shrill allegations escalate, so on and so forth. Everyone competes to see who can be the victim, and everyone competes to see who can make the most extreme allegations, this sort of thing. That is not the case at all. That is in no way comparable to the reality of what the Cultural Revolution was. And there's a kind of horse before the carriage problem here in how we think of the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution was indeed not a contest of ideals. It was not to see who had the right philosophy, not at all. And at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, the most important, most powerful political leader in all of China was a man named Liu Shaoqi. I'm not insulting my audience to say, most likely, if you speak English as your first language, you have never heard of Liu Shaoqi today. He was he was erased from the history of China to some extent, but of course he was much more utterly forgotten, in the Western world. But Liu Shaoqi was not, he wasn't a political figure like Donald Trump, who had arisen to power suddenly. No, this is a guy with decades and decades of building his significance in Chinese communism and Chinese politics. And so at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, he was by far the most powerful, most important political leader in China. And he didn't just lose his power or lose his fame, he also ultimately lost his life in the Cultural Revolution. Now, sorry, it's an imperfect allegory to say a question of the cart before the horse or something. Many modern Western readers want to look at a scenario like this as if, well, the main point of what was going on was this sort of philosophical or ideological debate. Who had the best interpretation of the water margin? The water margin is a literary classic in China. I'd compare it to something like Shakespeare, in that it's a work of classical literature, but it's something that people actually do read, and they actually do watch on TV and in movies adapted in various ways. I mean, it's not obscure. Like Shakespeare, most people grow up and they've seen a few plays by Shakespeare, whether in a movie or reading it or what have you. So the idea that, people were trying to have a really serious conversation about the interpretation of this literary masterpiece from Chinese antiquity, and that debate just got out of hand. That's completely ridiculous. The debates about how to interpret a work of literature were 100% cynical and motivated by, I'm sorry to use the same words as my professor, use the same words as Wu Guoguang, a dirty, fierce power struggle. There never was any shred of legitimate discourse about that particular work of literature. Now, if you really want to get into the full scope of the Cultural Revolution, that was not the only ridiculous debate going on about Chinese history and classical literature. I mean, these debates. So to jump ahead to the very end, you have the criticism of Confucius, right? It wasn't a sincere set of literary or philosophical reflections on the value of the work of Confucius, the reflections on the career of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of the Qin dynasty. Let me make sure I'm getting his name right here. Qin Shi Huang, I think that's right. Yeah, I did get it right. It wasn't the case that, just one day people in the Communist Party wanted to reevaluate to what extent Qin Shi Huang might have actually been right, or they wanted to reevaluate, the philosophical legacy of Confucius. Or they just decided to get out this opera about the relationship of a particular emperor and a courtier and so on. Every single one of these was nakedly and obviously a power ploy to eliminate particular people in power. So the criticism of Confucius, believe it or not, was actually criticism directed towards Lin Biao. And Lin Biao, that became even more obvious after his death. So come back to my very basic summary of events there. Liu Shaoqi was the most important political leader in China. The Cultural Revolution eliminated him. After he was eliminated, the most important political leader in China was Lin Biao. The Cultural Revolution eliminated him too. If the Cultural Revolution had kept going on and on, then doubtless other political leaders would have stepped into the position of prominence and would have been eliminated in their turn. Everyone in China had already rehearsed this process of denouncing, defaming, and tearing down people in positions of authority above you, and then scrambling for the opportunity to replace them. This song and dance it was already old and familiar by the time the Cultural Revolution happened, so all parties launched into it with extreme cynicism, including Mao Zedong's own wife, who's considered the leader of the Gang of Four. The Gang of Four is what they were called when they were denounced. That was Mao Zedong's wife and her closest colleagues and associates, who did form a kind of ideological clique within the Communist Party, pushing for a certain direction. So the whole business of denunciation and counter-denunciation, it really fundamentally has nothing in common with the culture we see now of people canceling each other over their moral failings. The most important definitive aspect of cancel culture that ContraPoints is complaining of is that nobody has anything to win. It's malice in the strictest sense. It's people trying to harm someone, and they won't benefit from harming them. It's not the case that it's like you're trying to get someone fired so that you personally can be promoted and take over their job. That's different. That may be greed rather than malice. The phenomenon of cancel culture has to be understood as malice, pure and simple. Maybe there's some envy, maybe there's some sense of moral self-justification that you ratify yourself as a better person. But this is in no way comparable to the game that was being played both on a huge scale in China with the Cultural Revolution and on a sort of tiny scale. Now, within this video, I'm not going to get into all the evidence of this, but suppose someone were to say back, they've heard my perspective, but they really think I'm wrong. They really think sincerely that if you examine the historical record, the participants in the Cultural Revolution, they argue, sincerely were trying to create a new and better system of education, to give one example, and they were sincerely trying to create a new and better system of local self-government, the equivalent of the mayor's office, but of course in a Communist Party system, the actual nomenclature used for local government is rather complex and turgid. Well, if someone did have that perspective sincerely, as soon as you start examining the historical evidence, what you find is instead, just like kind of ridiculous debates about classical literature that resulted in eliminating Liu Shaoqi, eliminating Lin Biao, students did indeed eliminate their professors. They tore down their professors with these criticisms of this kind, allegations, denunciations, show trials, and so on and so forth. They didn't have a new and better system of education to replace the old one with, right? I mean, some students manage to force their way into university while denouncing the system of examination. So, well, writing exams is bourgeois, so I don't have to do it. Again, this is clearly self-serving. They didn't have a new philosophy of education. They didn't have a new way to organize a classroom or organize a university or even organize exams. They were tearing things down and tearing people down and destroying people's lives in a manner that was very nakedly self-serving. Now, for me, the greatest farce is actually the replacement of local governments, where you'll have a town. Again, the names are very, very similar, but you'll have a particular town or city that's being governed by a Communist Party committee. So, again, the names are, but it'll be something like, okay, the city of Shanghai is being ruled by the Communist Party committee to govern Shanghai. You have this huge amount of violence. People get killed, people get denounced, people get put on trials and what have you. People get denounced for being bourgeois and what have you, being secretly capitalist voters and all these other things. And they announce that the Communist Party government is abolished. So now instead of the Communist Party Council, now the city is ruled and governed by the Revolutionary Committee. It's not just that the names seem interchangeable, and it's not any better in Chinese. Okay, so this is what you guys fought for. When you look at how the government actually functions, what actually happens, what they do, it's very clear there was no philosophy. There wasn't a new idea of what government should be. For example, they didn't have elections. They didn't say, okay, we're getting rid of the old communist system, and now we're going to have a democratic system. No, they basically tore down one communist despotism to replace it with another identical communist despotism. It was identical in every way, except that the particular people in charge were different. So this happened in universities. This happened with the city hall, city council of government, this kind of thing. This also happened with things like hospitals. People denounced and tore down the medical authorities who were in charge of the hospital and this kind of thing. All over China, institutions big and small, cities big and small, there was this sort of challenge to authority from Red Guards, from revolutionary committees, what have you. And then the real halt to this kind of aimless, self-serving power grab that happened across China with the early Cultural Revolution was generally the militarization of the situation. So sooner or later, the military would step in and say, okay, too many people are getting shot in the streets, so the military would step in and begin directly administering things themselves. And that is one of the reasons why this didn't result in mass starvation in the same way that the Great Leap Forward did. So to be clear, I'm not saying nobody starved during the Cultural Revolution, but it wasn't the kind of scale of tens of millions of people starving to death that you had during the Great Leap Forward and other dislocations. And again, one of the reasons was everyone had been through this before. Everyone had rehearsed this before. Everyone knew the rules of the game they were playing, including most of all the military. And the Chinese People's Liberation Army, they stepped in and stabilized the situation. And ultimately, they snuffed out the Red Guards. They snuffed out the Cultural Revolution. Now, so the way the question was posed to me reflects the challenge of forming some image of what the Cultural Revolution was and why it mattered in the Western imagination. And I sympathize. The guy who posed the question to me had the idea that the Cultural Revolution is somehow similar to what ContraPoints is complaining about with cancel culture. And I guess that is one kind of moral you can put to the story. I can see why you would want to think of the history that way. The Cultural Revolution is a peculiar one because the damage done was much smaller than the damage done by the Great Leap Forward. And it's not going to produce the kind of best-selling hit books that the devastation of the Great Leap Forward produced. The nature of the violence is more decentralized and participatory than, say, the violence of Joseph Stalin when he carried out his purges. That's a one centralized authority hunting down and killing people, ultimately like a list drawn up by Joseph Stalin and so on for who was going to be killed. So it's unlikely to kind of endure along in the Western English-speaking imagination the way that maybe the atrocities of Stalin's history or even the atrocities of other periods within communist China's history will endure. And as I say, nobody today in the West remembers the names Liu Shaoqi or Lin Biao. Nobody is interested in what kind of moral might be put to the story from that perspective. Conversely, nobody is making positive excuses for the Cultural Revolution anymore. I grew up in a household with two adults, two white Western adults, who supported the Cultural Revolution in China. In my father's case, he continued supporting it to his grave. He went to his death never recanting. And there was a very intentionally contrived short biographical film made about both of my parents. And they chose to make a statement. It's, as I recall, kind of 3/4 of the way through the film. It's not at the beginning, it's not right at the very end. But toward the end of that film, they had this very carefully made statement that they always had supported the Chinese Cultural Revolution, that they always would, and that what they saw, what they aspired for the future of Canada was a Cultural Revolution for Canada, similar to what China's Cultural Revolution was in China. Now, nobody would be more astonished at that than Chinese communists themselves, because even within China, and even within the Chinese Communist Party, it is universally agreed that the Cultural Revolution was a flop, was a failure, was terrible, even if they sympathized with its goals, that it failed to achieve those goals. And of course, in reality, most of them do not sympathize with its goals. And that's why China is a capitalist country today. It's a capitalist country with no democracy under a communist dictatorship. Nevertheless, you could say that the tragedy of the Cultural Revolution was that it destroyed the last idealism that existed in China. It proved to everyone in China that these ideals were nothing more than a mask put on an assassin's face, and that the assassinations that proceeded under that mask, under that cloak, were exactly this kind of skullduggery of killing Liu Shaoqi or eliminating Lin Biao one after the other so that somebody else could try to take their seat, could try to move up the ladder in the very strange social competition that defines a communist oligarchy, communist despotism. So even from a sincere pro-communist perspective, it's regarded as a disaster. And then if you have some kind of detached critical perspective, it's even more of a disaster. And if you wanted to take the ideological discussion seriously, 5 minutes after the Cultural Revolution ends, what happens to their system of education? They go back to their traditional system of education that they had before, and if anything, they start getting interested in imitating the American system of education. It's interesting to know. But they completely abandon any supposedly socialist or communist ideals, or even egalitarian ideals about education, all abandoned. The reform of local government, the mayor's office, all completely abandoned. Everything goes back to the way it was before, being ruled by a Communist Party committee or Communist Party council, whatever it may be called. What even happens with the philosophy of Confucius? So you have this huge nationwide campaign, I think it lasted at least 3 years, denouncing Confucius, right? 5 minutes after it's over, the Communist Party of China begins again kind of preaching Confucius as if it's a kind of philosophical glue that holds the Chinese people together, that what they share is this common heritage of the philosophy of Confucius. So it fails on every level and in every way, unless you look at it as a dirty power struggle, as if you see the success of the Cultural Revolution being that people got out there and managed to eliminate their enemies. So what we're discussing here, the excuse for this set of reflections on what is the Cultural Revolution, cancel culture as it exists today. In many ways, what we're discussing with cancel culture is more bleak and more depressing. Because, if one man murders another because he needs to steal a loaf of bread to feed himself and his own family, none of us approve of murder, and none of us approve of his motivation, but we can at least see the rationality behind that crime, that there's a desperation, there's a self-interested motive that drove this man to murder. And what we see with cancel culture is much more comparable to someone who is sadistically and psychopathically carrying out murder when they have absolutely nothing to gain themselves, when they can't benefit from it in any way. And that's a side of human nature that the anonymity of the internet has made more visible and more vicious than ever before. And I don't think it compares in any way to the tremendous risks people took in China in the Cultural Revolution, non-anonymously, to stand up on a stage in front of a live audience and point the finger and denounce someone for having betrayed the revolution or adopted some bourgeois ideology. This was what was done. And then to have that debated, in front of the roar of the crowd, and they'd normally have some kind of soldier sitting there as a so-called judge, and to risk one's own life and to imperil someone else's life. People did that with cold calculation, having grown up with one cycle after another of this kind of internecine, low-level civil war, cyclically in China since the Communist Revolution. People staked their lives on it. They staked their careers on it. They knew this was their chance to get ahead. And the only way to get ahead, the only form of free market competition in that society, in that system, was by tearing somebody else down. I doubt that in many cases it's even as sympathetic as someone committing murder for the sake of a loaf of bread, but we can at least sympathize with the desperation involved. When we look at the people who are denouncing ContraPoints, or the people who've denounced me, I have my own long history of being canceled here on YouTube. Sadly, if we ask the question, who benefits and how, I think the answers we come to are even more depressing than the blood-soaked history of Chinese communism.